What's up, guys? This is Mr. Eldridge, and in today's lesson, we're going to look at two specific groups during this Gilded Age. First, we're going to look at immigrants, then we're going to look at Native Americans. Between 1870 and 1900, cities doubled, tripled, and even quadrupled in size due to private and state investment in infrastructure, factories, stores, and living spaces. Ready to fill these new complexes and jobs were masses of new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, as well as many Jews escaping persecution in France and from the Cossacks. These were militant self-governing communities in Russia. Cities grew outward and upward with skyscrapers propelled by cheap steel and financial institutions. New mechanized factories and other corporate institutions boomed in the 19th century, and many immigrants and rural migrants rushed to cities to capitalize on this opportunity. On the West Coast, many Chinese immigrants flooded the United States for opportunities in mining, railroads, and other construction projects as they flooded the abysmal conditions in China that suffered from the war and famine during the Taiping Rebellion and, of course, the Opium Wars. Many ethnic groups settled in what's called ethnic clusters to maintain a familiar culture and environment in new countries. An ethnic cluster is when groups of people would move into a city and stay close to people that were similar to their home country. Places that are created are like Chinatown in Little Italy. Cities like New York quickly developed into self-segregating districts that became little versions of these home countries. In these ethnic clusters, immigrants were able to engage in their native language and interact with like-minded and like-cultured individuals while also slowly being assimilated into American culture and opportunity. As more and more people came to the United States, there was an overpopulation going into these cities. And what happens is you have the treatment of these new immigrants coming into the United States. They were often called the quote-unquote others. In the 1880s, a photojournalist by the name of Jacob Riis wrote How the Other Half Lives, documenting the conditions in New York City slums during this time period. It served as a basis for future muckraking journalism by exposing the slums to New York City's upper and middle classes. How the Other Half Lives quickly became a landmark in the annals of social reform. Riis documented the filth, disease, exploitation, and overcrowding that characterized the experience of more than 1 million immigrants. He helped push tenant reform to the front of New York City's political agenda and prompted then Commissioner of the Police, Theodore Roosevelt, to close down the police-run poorhouses. Roosevelt later called Riis the most useful citizen of New York. Riis's idea inspired Jack London to write a similar expose on London's East End called The People of the Abyss. Finally, if we're talking about immigrants, we must talk about immigration policy. Prejudice between immigrants ran rampant as certain shops or neighborhoods were unwelcoming to other ethnicities. These problems were compounded by nativist movements to limit or end immigration on the basis of race or ethnicity, of predominantly white Americans in favor of natural-born American citizens. These nativist movements opposed immigration en masse as a threat to their Protestant Western culture and language. Many Americans, even non-nativists, opposed the influx of competing wage laborers as immigrants tended to drive down wages. Nativist movements formed against immigrants from Irish, Eastern and Southern European immigrants on the East Coast of the United States and against Chinese immigrants on the West Coast of the United States even succeeding in limiting immigration by passing acts such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Not only were physically and mentally unhealthy immigrants turned away upon arrival, but many were expected to assimilate into American culture and to adopt English. While Americanization wasn't inserted into public schools, it was certainly on the minds of American citizens and nativists to oppose the influx and, quote, taint of foreign culture and indoctrinate immigrants in the ways of the West. Also, when we talk about this period, we have to talk about Indian policies. Due to a multitude of problems and impracticality, the United States government had abandoned the strategy of settling Indian disputes with treaties, or honoring the treaty lines that had been drawn out for reservations by 1872. On the frontier, unsanctioned attacks took place both ways between the Indians and the settlers, and both lived in legitimate fear of a raid by the opposing party. The United States Army was also slow or completely unable to stop white settlers from moving into reservations. Many Indian tribes declined to stay within the borders and attempted to continue their nomadic way of life in following the buffalo herds, particularly warring tribes such as the Sioux, the Apache, and the Cheyenne. One of the last treaties formed by the United States government was the Fort Laramie Treaty that limited and protected Sioux in the West Dakota region. However, with the discovery of gold in the Black Hills of the Dakota region, it was nearly impossible to enforce the border on floods of white settlers, and conflicts between white settlers and Indian tribes, most notably the Sioux, increased. At the close of the 18th century, there were between 30 and 60 million bison on the continent. By the time of this photograph that you see, that population was reduced to only 456 wild bison. The change in U.S. policy towards Indians in the 1870s and 1880s resulted in a series of conflicts between the United States Army, white settlers, and American Indians. The Indians were at a substantial disadvantage as they lacked the sheer number, technology, and organization to field a large industrial force in order to face the U.S. Army. Particularly as many tribes often operated independently in the past, one of the more nefarious tactics to chisel away at the Plains Indians' way of life was to eliminate these buffalo herds. Commissioned and encouraged by the United States Army in the 1870s, whites nearly decimated the wild populations of buffaloes as hunters, such as Buffalo Bill, refined the technique of herding the stampedes into cycles to be shot en masse by horse-riding riflemen. Between 1872 and 1875, over 9 million buffalo were killed, skinned, and most left to rot on the plains. In an attempt to maintain their traditional way of life, the ghost dance movement, led by Wovoka in the 19th century, united many Indians. As more so a millenarian religious practice, it called for, among other things, the renewing of society and a return to the traditional buffalo-based lifestyle of the Plains Indians. Fortunately for the Sioux tribes who practiced the dance, the United States Army interpreted the mass meeting as a military maneuver, and when attempting to disarm Indians at Wounded Knee in 1890, discharged rifles that resulted in the deaths of scores of unarmed and even innocent Indians by the United States Army. The surrender of the Plains tribes in the 1880s and 1890s, especially after Wounded Knee, the United States Census Bureau officially declared the end of the frontier, as an Indian opposition had been virtually eliminated. Many Native Americans attempted to adopt a new lifestyle and settle down as farmers in areas such as the Oklahoma Territory. Some, such as the Apache, remained nomadic, while others, such as the Sioux, attempted a hybrid approach of light agriculture while still living off of the buffalo. While the Sioux and others, such as the Cheyenne, opposed American control, some, such as the Crow and the Hadarta, assimilated into American life and adopted permanent settlements, agriculture, and private property. There were also attempts by the United States government to assimilate and Americanize Indians to boarding schools through policies such as the Dawes Act of 1887, which attempted to facilitate the settlement of Indians as landowners and farmers by dividing tribal land into individual allotments. In the case of the many assimilated Indians, tribesmen would be placed into boarding schools that taught them English, agriculture, property owning, and American ideals. The same is roughly true for those movements.